welcome. I'm Susan Phillips, director of the school. We're going to start with an opening by Joe McQuarrie, elder of the Métis Nation. Carleton recognizes that we are on unceded First Nations territory, and we like the importance of being able to open ourselves to the right kinds of clear-headedness for all of the work that we're going to do today. Elder McQuarrie.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I imagine you were all up quite early this morning to get here on time, and I was operating on Métis time, so I was almost maybe about 3 or 4 minutes late. So the first thing I'd like to do is thank the Creator for bringing us all together. We've come from various walks of life, and it's always interesting to me how we come together as a family on these occasions. And I'm looking forward to meeting you this morning and being with you at least until noon. I'd like you to stand, if you will. First of all, thanks to the Algonquin Nation, on whose land we're meeting today. We thank them for their hospitality and, in some cases, tolerance. I'd like to invite the spirits of our ancestors to be with us and to guide us through the day, to help us make our decisions and all. Creator, we come before you in humility, and we thank you for the many gifts that you have given us. We are very grateful to be here to celebrate the 60 years of Carleton's program, and also to launch the new programs that are being developed. We thank you for the light you bring to this family gathering. Grant us the vision and grant us the opportunity to continue to be there for each other in good times as well as in not so good times. Give us strength and fortitude to ride the tides of change, and empower us always to be nurturing and loving with one another. Open our spiritual eyes that we may see one another for who we truly are and love one another in the same spirit. May sadness, disappointment, and anger be minimal. May happiness, positive thoughts, and good experiences together be bountiful. May we always cope and hope with each other with grace. We ask you, Creator, to bless each person gathered here today, and also thank you for helping us to celebrate the 60th anniversary of Carleton's program, and also bless the individuals who are and were instrumental in ensuring that Aboriginal people are recognized, and thank you, and also bless the school for focusing for a time on the Aboriginal people, the students who come here. Bless the staff for their indulgence, and we ask you to be with us all day at least, and keep us safe. Miigwech. Okay. Shall I sit down there? Oh, she'll come up. Thank you. Sit down with me. Okay.
A small token of our appreciation.
Oh, this is lovely. Thank you very much. Gather all my belongings. I'll take the water.
This is the serious part of our 3-day or 3-part series. We had the great reception last night where we celebrated with our alumni the policy conversation today, and we do mean it to be a conversation, not a conference. We will have our guests seated in without tables, without PowerPoint, without any visual distraction between you and them, so you can engage the conversation with them. And of course, we're having the student-led banquet this evening. I'd like to introduce our dean, Andre Plourde, to provide a welcome on behalf of the university. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. On this beautiful, warm, sunny spring day in Ottawa, welcome to Carleton. And welcome to the Faculty of Public Affairs. It's an honor to be here with you today. I kind of, in a sense, listening to Susan, had a bit of a panic. Academics without PowerPoint concept. Anyways, thanks. It's a pleasure, again, a pleasure to be here. Thanks, everybody, for being. It was interesting, looking at the program, it reminded me of the range of things that actually happen in the School of Public Policy in Administration, the range of expertise that you find in here. So everything from social and economic policy to indigenous policy and governance, and the whole sets of issues that are treated that way. And I think that's important for us as forming the next generation of Canada's public service. The one thing that I found, but it also led me to think about a lot of the issues that have come up in terms of both policy research and also policy analysis, and discussions about whether it is valuable and valued to be in these areas. We've known the challenges of the last while. And in a sense, I think if it's not valued, somehow research in areas like this will not happen in some real sense. But it's also clear that I think we've got to realize that who values policy research these days might be a different or a broader range of clientele, to use business types of words, than was before. Then it becomes our responsibility to disseminate this knowledge in non-traditional formats to non-traditional organizations. So in a sense, I think this is part of the challenge of what we see over the next 60 years, to take the theme of the conference. If we want to create or to recognize the value in the work that we do, that the traditional clientele might be less interested, but we believe there's value in our work, we've got to find the people who realize that value, recognize that value, and bring it to them. Which brings me to kind of a tension as a policy wonk that I've had over many years, to say one thing that has happened, I would argue, over the last 3 decades or so, is that we've put, as a society, we've put the role of the state very much as a question. If you think of the 1960s, 1970s, there was an understanding, almost implicit in government policy and basic approaches to how we organized our lives, about what the role of the state was in delivering services, that kind of thing. That has changed. And I don't think it has come to any kind of we've not come to some kind of agreement. There's no consensus. There's no conventional wisdom, I think, on this anymore, which opens the door for research in these areas. And I think that's another part of our challenges over the next while, is to help us and to help find, or at least examine, what the role of the state is in developing policy, what kinds of policies would make sense in this newly redefined or new redefined role of the state. So in my mind, these are exciting times to be doing policy work, to be studying policy, to be studying public administration and public policy, in part because there are challenges. We're not sure where things are going. We're not sure. And that really, as a researcher, should excite us at some level, that we can help chart the course over the next decades. And so I wish the next 60 to be an exciting period of time in the school, the history of the school. So before leaving, I'd like to take a second to thank Susan Phillips and her team, the organizers of the event last night, the organizers today, to wish you all a great day at this workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. Let me give you a little bit of logic of how we put the program together. We wanted it, first of all, to be a mix of what we do in the school. And what we do in the school is very much about public policy and public management. You have to understand policy and figure out what to do with it from beginning to end, how to develop the policy, how to manage it, how to implement it. We want to mix research and practice. We want to know what are current practices, what are desired practices, and what does the research say, and then how do they come together. And we value different perspectives, different disciplinary perspectives, different ways of approaching issues. So we started with that, and we said we want a mix of all of those things. We also wanted this to be part of taking the next 60 quite seriously, to say, what have we done really well so far, and what are we moving into in the future that represents where we are going? And we started with a committee. Of course we started with a committee. We teach administration. We're very fortunate to have a great alumni committee of very engaged professionals in government and in other places help us put together the event. So you'll find, and then I delegated. So each of the panels has a lead, and then I could just stand back and watch. So each of the panels has a moderator who put together the panel, again with a mix. Some of our own faculty, some students, some alum, some experts in the field who are engaged in practice or in observation and commentary in other ways. The first two panels are very much of what we've done, what have been our long-standing strengths as a school, thinking about the nexus of economic and social policy, and thinking about what does it mean for a public service to guide policy and to guide what we do as a country. And then the next are really looking to where we're going, considering sustainable energy. We brought in the new Masters in Sustainable Energy a couple of years ago, and Indigenous policy and governance, where we've had strengths, certainly historically, but where we're most actively building in our next 60, or the first of our next 60. So, without further commentary, I'd like to introduce Alan Maslow, who is the lead for the first panel on the vanishing distinction between economic and social policy.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you all and to be part of this exciting event for the school. Color of my remaining hairs aside and rumors aside, I was not here for the founding of the school, but if you think of the school as the biblical story, I was not at the Garden of Eden. I may have been on Noah's Ark, so a long time, and it's great to see the school doing this celebration. Our first panel this morning is about, as Susan mentioned, the nexus between social and economic policy. We have 4 distinguished panelists with us, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing them. Their bios are in the program, which you've seen, and I'd rather have the time for you to hear more from them. But starting at my far left, Munir Sheikh, former Chief Statistician of Canada, and even more, a distinguished visiting fellow here at the school. We're pleased to have him here. Sitting next to him is Michael Prince, again, a former colleague here at the school, now currently at University of Victoria. In the middle is Rachel Laforêt, who is a PhD alumnus of the school and now an associate professor at Queen's University. And sitting what will be closest to me is Andrew Coyne, who as yet does not have an affiliation with the school, but we'll work on that. So the topic on this first panel. I'm going to start and pose a question to the panelists, give them each about 5 minutes to respond to it. Then we will have an open discussion, and then towards the end of the session, we'll open the floor to comments and questions from members of the group here. And there are 2 aisle mics, and at the time we will invite you to go to those mics to ask your question. It seems to me, and this in some ways I think follows from, or is an aspect of what Andre Plourde mentioned in his opening comment about the questioning of the role of the state. Social policy over the last couple of decades perhaps, discussions of social policy, at least, the language has become more and more dominated by economic impacts and the economic constraints on action. So now when we talk, for example, about immigration policy, we talk about labor supply. Now when we talk about social assistance, the first thing we talk about is work incentives. And most recently, which I think may be the dominant social policy question for the coming decade, when we talk about growing income equality, it's immediately linked to economic growth, and whether it is a consequence of economic growth, A, or B, whether one can actually address this without, in some fashion, damaging economic growth. So my first question, and we will go alphabetically and then from there on open it up. What does this changing rhetoric, this changing nature of discussion mean for actual social policy? And secondly, since the conference is about the next 60 years, we won't ask our panelists to prognosticate quite that far into the future, but what are the implications of this for social policy as we move forward? So Andrew, you get to lead off.
Well, thank you, Alan. I'm not sure I would phrase it quite as strongly as that economic policy is, taking over social policy. Perhaps that's not what you meant to imply, but I'm not sure that's the case, and I'm not sure it would be a bad thing if we did, however, see them in an integrated way. I don't want to subsume social policy and economic policy, or economic policy and social policy, but I do think it's important to see them in an integrated, holistic way. We don't want to ignore distributional outcomes when we're framing economic policy, and we don't want to ignore the economic outcomes when we're looking at social policy. I think in practical terms that means we need to be considering the implications of policy in one area for policy in other areas outside that silo. So, for example, if we have a very skewed income distribution, particularly at the bottom, that's going to reflect not only in the distribution of income, but in health outcomes, and indeed for the economy as a whole, efficiency outcomes. A solid safety net, on the other hand, can make people more willing to take risks with their human capital, more willing to move about the country, and so that has payoffs not just in terms of raising people up at the bottom, but again in terms of the flexibility of labor markets, and I see nothing wrong with seeing those in an integrated way, and people on the right in particular should acknowledge these linkages. Similarly, however, I think we also have to be willing to acknowledge that poorly designed social assistance or employment insurance programs are going to affect and have effects on work incentives, and it seems to me to be foolish to ignore that, and I think people on the left have to be willing to recognize that as well. So again, getting beyond the silos and getting beyond the right-left divides, I think there's actually opportunity for people to come to some degree of consensus on these things. I mean, we're going to hear from Munir and others perhaps of some of the failings of social policy in Canada, and there's lots of areas in which we can improve, but I'll just put in a note of some optimism that I think we've been making some progress, particularly on what I think should be the focus of any just society, which is on the lot of those at the very bottom. It does not get enough attention, but over the last 15, 20 years, we have seen a remarkable decline in the percentage of the population living below the StatsCan low-income cutoff. We are now down to the lowest percentage since they've been collecting data on this. We can get into the reasons for that, but one of the reasons, obviously one reason is pretty steady economic growth from 1993 through 2008. But another reason is good public policy. We've been making progress on designing social transfers through things like the working income tax benefit, the guaranteed income supplement, the GST tax credit, the national child benefit, and I'm not going to say these are perfectly designed, but these are, relatively speaking, intelligent applications of public policy and have the makings of a nascent minimum income program. We're not, I think, ever going to arrive at that in any kind of big bang way, but I think we are kind of putting the pieces together in a way that I think is quite encouraging. The downside, the more pessimistic side, is we've got enormous challenges going forward the next few decades in terms of the demographic and fiscal challenge, and that is inevitably going to impinge upon our social policy questions. We are going to have to be very conscious about making available every scrap of labor supply, person hour of labor supply we possibly can. For the last 40 or 50 years, the challenge was finding jobs for workers. In the next 40, 50 years, it's going to be finding workers for jobs. And that's going to affect a whole range of policy choices in terms of immigration, in terms of encouraging people to work longer in their lives, in terms of reforming health care, because of course that's going to be the biggest part of the demographic challenge is the cost of health care for the elderly, and in terms of raising national productivity rates so that we can generate the wealth we need to pay for the cost of these through our tax and transfer system. The final point I'll make is, in terms of looking at these things in an integrated way, I really think we need to consider the questions of efficiency and equity, not as separate and completely divorced ideas, but in an integrated way. There's a set of principles, set of instruments that are appropriate to each. And I'll say in broad brush terms that markets and prices are, generally speaking, better instruments for allocative efficiency, for making sure that resources go to producing the goods that people want at the prices they're willing to pay for them. And taxes and transfers are the better instruments for achieving distributional equity. And yet we're forever crossing the wires. We're trying to achieve allocative efficiency by providing tax credits and subsidies, generally I think with very indifferent or worse results. And we keep trying to twist prices to achieve our distributional ends. We figure we can fix a price here or a wage there, and somehow it'll work to the benefit of those worst off. And as often as not, it doesn't, because A, because these are very poorly targeted ways of going about it, but B, because when you create, as you often do when you fix a price and don't allow it to move to the market clearing level, you're creating dislocations, shortages, surpluses, excess costs, and typically the people who bear the burden of those costs are not the rich and the powerful. They're people on the margins and the poor. And so we have to be conscious about that, it seems to me, when we're thinking about social policy, that I think it's of keeping the right instrument for the right target. When we do that, as I say, when we use taxes and transfers, when we take from the rich and give to the poor, we get rather better results than when we, as I say, when we just fix prices and hope for the best. So what I would urge as a sort of overarching term for that is what is sometimes called a social market approach, that I think, again, can reconcile some of what are sometimes presented as being hard and fast divisions, that if we can achieve allocative efficiency using markets, we can achieve our distributional goals by redistributing the results of those market processes rather than by trying to get in there and gum up the works with it.
Rachel.
So I'm going to agree with your proposition that economic considerations have really come to dominate social policy issues. I think you gave some great examples, and I will take that further. I think that short-term labor market needs are trumping longer-term social policy issues such as nation building, citizenship, social integration. Immigration is a great example of that, where we used to be bringing in future Canadians, thinking about future generations, and really being careful about giving them the ability to integrate into society. And now we're bringing in a slew of people for temporary short-term labor market needs, and we're not thinking about the implications for these vulnerable populations. So to me, that's a big issue, and the impact that it's having on social policy, and this has been clearly evidenced, is that there's social inequalities on the rise across Canada, particularly for vulnerable populations, for youth, for families, for immigrants. And the consequence of that, we keep seeing disengagement, disenfranchisement, decline in interpersonal trust, in engagement in civil society organizations, intergenerational equity. Now, Canada isn't alone in the shift. All OECD countries have seen the similar trends. And in many ways, the welfare system on which we built the balance between economic growth and social cohesion has become obsolete, and we need to rethink that model. The structural conditions on which that model was based are constant economic growth. It was based on the idea that if we could just get people into permanent employment, well-paid employment, then they could do better economically. That's no longer true. Young people face increasingly casual employment, unstable in and out employment, which is creating some difficulties for youth in particular in terms of career progression. It was based on the male breadwinner model, where you could have, a family income insured with the male breadwinner. That's no longer true. Family structures are being transformed. There's growing female employment, which is creating some issues around work care reconciliation, work care for kids, but also for aging population. And that leads to weakening of family solidarity. We've also seen changes in immigration flow, which are creating greater ethnic pluralization and also creating some stresses and tensions around social cohesion. So all of that leads to greater social marginality for the most disadvantaged individuals. And I would disagree that it's not just the people below the low income cutoff. It's having impact on the middle class as well. Our traditional institutions and instruments that have been protecting citizens from social risk have been weakening, and we need to rethink that. Since the 1990s, governments have reduced the progressivity of our tax system and cut social transfers such as employment insurance and social assistance, and as a result, our tax transfer system is much less effective in terms of reducing inequality than it's been in the past. So we were asked, should we still continue to pursue social justice and a just society? And I would say yes. We don't need to change the goals, but we need to think about the policy instruments that we're using. We need to find policies, public policies that are adapted to this new reality. And I think that we need to pay particular attention to developing not just economic opportunities, but also social opportunities, to strengthening patterns of reciprocity and exchange, reinforcing civil society organization, maintaining support structures. And to me, just to end this, is where I think Canada is facing a huge challenge. Over the past 20 years, the space for dialogue and debate in Canada around social policy has been hollowing out. The federal government is not interested in engaging with civil society actors or even provinces around social policy. So there's no space where we can have a discussion about what type of country that we want. Civil society organizations have been weakened by funding cuts, by lack of access. And I think that an important channel for citizens to be participating in this dialogue, to be challenging government around social policy, is slowly declining, and I find that worrisome.
Thank you. Michael?
Thank you. I thought about this, a good question about whether there's a vanishing distinction. There is in some areas of social and economic policy, and there aren't in others. And I think, picking up partly on what I think Rochelle's talking about, there's in fact some widening gaps between economic and social policy. At the same time, simultaneously, we can see, certainly in the labor market policy areas and in immigration, social policy is so vast, covering about 3/4 of what any government does in this country in terms of its budgets and its programming, that you can pick an area and you can probably support the thesis that there's a vanishing distinction, but you can find several other areas at the same time where I think the gaps are widening. There's an old saying that's still around, at least in BC where I live, where we have a very conservative liberal government, and you hear the phrase, the best social policy is a job. And that phrase has been around for centuries. The trouble is the quality of the jobs being produced now are getting weaker and weaker. In fact, fewer than half of Canadians now work in what's called standard employment. So I think we have to drop that phrase in our vocabulary as to what's a standard job, and most people are not working at a regular full-time, full-year job anymore. So the idea that the best social policy is a job really is a problematic claim, much loved by governments on the center right. Andrew's remarks made me think of a former colleague here at Carleton, Irwin Gillespie, the late Irwin Gillespie, a wonderful economist, a book he wrote called In Search of Robin Hood many years ago, I think in the late 60s, early 70s, Alan, sometime. And we have lost Robin Hood. We live in an age of the politics of tax relief, tax cuts, and there's hardly any politicians in any parties with the courage to talk about adequate funding of public services in this country. And that, to me, reinforces the distinction between economic and social policy, the quality of the jobs. Celebrating 60 years, I thought back over that time period when the school was about 15 years old, so about 1968, the Medical Care Act was being implemented. It had been postponed for 2 years because of concern about the impact of Medicare on the Canadian economy. So there the distinction was, or the links were pretty clear. Mitchell Sharp and other Liberal cabinet ministers arguing very forcefully and effectively to postpone for 2 years the implementation of Medicare. It took another 5 years for it to be implemented across the country. 15 years later, when the school was 30, we had, in his last few months, Pierre Trudeau and Monique Bégin passed the Canada Health Act, because things quite hadn't unfolded the way people thought with the Medical Care Act. And there, the clash of extra billing and opting out by physicians across the country showed, again, I think, a clash between what I would call economic policy and social policy. 15 years after that, we had the Social Union Framework Agreement, SUFA. For those of you who remember that, there's a little blast from the past there for some of you. And again, not just about struggling around social policy. And that reminds me of where we are today in terms of the Federation. And in the Harper years, we have a vision of federalism that I would argue has actually widened the distinction again between social and economic policy. Increasingly, social policy in Canada is provincial social policy. I mean, it always has been. But for those of us, and many of my colleagues still like to think about pan-Canadian social citizenship and these wonderful, quaint phrases, which quite frankly died. Executive federalism is basically dead. Collaborative federalism is on life support if it's still alive. And so increasingly the action in social policy in Canada is at the subnational levels or in Indigenous governments and not at the federal level. So for those of us who used to equate Canadian social policy with the Canadian government and with nation building, that's sorely tested, I think, in a lot of areas, except for in certain areas around law and order and justice and corrections, where there's still a very forceful exercise of federal jurisdiction on social policy. So the distinction is there in some places, it's not in others. The next 60 years, these are 150-year-old debates around, or even older. I think actually they go back to the Elizabethan poor laws of the late 16th century, when the notion of the principle of less eligibility. You should never pay anyone on welfare anything remotely close to what the lowest paid worker can get in the labor market, because that will create work disincentive. So that's a 500-year-old idea in Anglo-Saxon countries. Canada continues to practice that in many of our social policies. So the distinctions and the tensions between economic and social policy will continue in the next 60 years. And as the Dean said, there's wonderful opportunities for research on this and to engage in the debates. The characters may change, the prime ministers may come and go, but the issues and the underlying tensions between the poor and the rich, the powerless and the powerful will continue. And so I look forward to working with people on that over the coming years. Thank you.
Mike, you there?
I don't think anybody would disagree that economic policy, depending on how you do it, would have social consequences. Similarly, I don't think anybody would disagree that depending on how you do social policy would have economic outcomes. So should the two policies be looked together to determine their economic and social effects? I would say absolutely. I mean, this is just simple common sense. The question then is, are we doing that? I would suggest that there are some examples where that happens, but mostly it's my experience, having spent a bit of time in the social policy area since I left government, that we don't do much of it, in effect, I think there's a huge gap where we are developing policies in silos, and there are lots and lots of statistics. Of course, former chief statistician, I want to look at the numbers, which I think would demonstrate without too much doubt that we don't really do a good job at looking at these two policies together. There seems to be a view that somehow there's a bit of a trade-off between economic and social. But when you look at the experience of what I would say high performer countries, there really isn't much of a trade-off. I looked at data, for example, for the Scandinavian countries, which people think of as social democracies. I want to call them as social economic democracies. If you look at those countries' experience, they have done much better than Canada on social outcomes. They've done much better than Canada on economic outcomes, and they've done much better than Canada on environmental outcomes. This concept of a trade-off between these objectives, I don't think is warranted as long as the quality of our economic and social policies is poor. So in Canada, are economic considerations dominating social policy more and more? My answer is absolutely not. The second point I want to make is that if that is the case, why do we have this perception that economic policy seems to be dominating more and more social policy? And the answer is we are confusing economic with fiscal. Fiscal considerations, of course, are having a huge impact on social policy. And let me, in this context, give a bit of information on this very popular debate on income distribution, the middle class. If you look at data for Canada over the past 30 years, the share of income going to the top 20% of the income distribution, which we can call the rich, it has gone up, the market income share, it has gone up by 7.8 percentage points to 52%, which is a huge change. Interestingly, the share of income, market income, going to the middle three quintiles has gone down by exactly 7.8 percentage points. So the income has shifted from the middle to the top. The share of income going to the lowest 20% is flat. It hasn't changed. It hasn't moved one bit. And again, I'm talking here about market income. Now you ask yourself the question, what has public policy done in response to this? If you look at our tax transfer system, and by the way, all of this information is available on CANSOM. If you look at the tax transfer system, the rich are contributing 48 cents on the dollar towards redistribution, an increase from 37 cents in 1980. So it's a huge increased redistribution. And of course, that has happened through the rich paying more taxes to all levels of government. Now, where has that money actually gone? And here is where it really is strange to look at these numbers. The share of the transfers to the middle class has gone up substantially. And the interesting part is that it is also the poor, the lowest 20%, who have transferred, tax transfer, income to the middle class. So the lowest 20% have faced a reduction in government transfers. The top 20% have seen a huge increase in their taxes. And all of this money coming into the transfer pot has gone to the middle class. So if you look at the situation of the middle class, for every dollar they have lost in market income share over this 30-year period, what have governments done in response? The answer is they have offset this dollar decline in their income share by 47 cents. So they're still behind 53 cents. So we have a huge issue on our hands, which is that the markets are driving down the share of the middle income group, and the governments have to come up with a view as to what to do with it. They've done a lot, but of course it's still not enough. The worrying part here is that this transfer has also happened from the poor to the middle class. And the question is, is that appropriate? And the other question is the degree of transfer that has happened, which of course still haven't offset the market changes. Is that an appropriate change, or should we need to do more or less? The third point I want to make is, as I said in the beginning, there are examples of economic, social working together. There are many examples of where they're not working together. Social assistance program, Ontario's, of course, is one example where those doing social policy don't even think that the economic side exists. There are just so many problems with this program that it is about time to completely ditch this program and start afresh because of its negative economic consequences. But I would suggest that a very useful indicator to look at is the marginal effective tax rates, which really sum up the impact of all social policies and their impact together from an economic perspective. I think it will come as a shock to a lot of people that if you look at the marginal effective tax rates for the OECD countries, there are 35 countries, our meters or marginal effective tax rates are the second highest, among those 35 countries. And of course, if you want to figure out the impact of social policy on economic outcomes, it's the meter one should look at, and it doesn't look good. My main point I want to make is we need to take into account the cross effects from economic to social and social to economic. But institutionally, in Canada, we are not set up to do anything like this. I've spent many years in the federal government. The federal government is not set up to look into these cross effects and do something about it. And of course, with our federal system, as was said, social policy is mostly provincial. There's no mechanism to take the two things together and figure out what is the best mix of economic and social. And I want to again emphasize the point that if you look at the experience of high-performing countries, there really isn't much of a trade-off between the two.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all of you for provocative starts. I would invite you to respond to each other in your next comments, but I wanted to just, I guess, highlight two themes that I heard, and you might want to react to those or to anything one of your fellow panelists have said. Everybody here agrees that efficiency and equity in some sense need to be considered together, that they're not, they shouldn't be in two separate silos. The conventional thinking in public policy, and especially in economics for many, many years, has been that they are trade-offs against one another. Indeed, there was Arthur Okun, who was a very accomplished policy economist in the United States, and somewhere I think in the 1980s, wrote a book called Equity versus Efficiency, the Big Trade-Off. And this kind of marked the state of the thinking at the time. I'm hearing partly that that's still true from some panelists, and hearing partly that that may not be true, that perhaps we can consider them together and they're not, at least not a one-to-one trade-off. So that's one issue I'd like to offer for people to respond to. The other is the question that Mike and Munir, I guess, most brought up, which is the structure of federalism in Canada and how that impacts on the way that we do social and economic policy in this country. So who would like to tackle either one or both of those? Andrew?
I'll go ahead. So the answer to your question, is there a trade-off, is yes and no. A lot of, to pick up the point I was making, the bottom end of my remarks is a lot of bad efficiency policy is also bad equity policy, and vice versa. So a lot of times we're inside the frontier of where there might be a trade-off, where it's at the stage where you can still get more of both. For example, if you've got tax preferences that primarily benefit the rich, let's say maybe if you have if you're overcompensating for the capital gains in the capital gains inclusion rate for the tax paid at the corporation, if you were giving too much recognition of that, that would be bad equity, because the people who would benefit from that would be up the income scale. It would make it less progressive. It also is inefficient. You don't want to distort people's investment choices by making them make investments for tax reasons rather than for the true economic returns. So there's lots of examples of those kinds of policies that are both inefficient and inequitable, and I think there's a lot of progress we can make in looking at those two together. I think it would be foolish, though, to say that there's no trade-off ever. There's lots of literature on at some point, and I think you don't have to be a supply-sider to think at some point, if you raise marginal tax rates too high, you are going to, there's lots of literature on this in terms of the work incentives and the incentives to invest, et cetera. So we can't have 100% tax brackets. And I don't think anybody's proposing that. So there is a notional trade-off at some point, but there's lots of progress we can make to get towards that. I thought Munir's point about the Scandinavian countries was well taken. And in fact, when you look at the human development charts, the league tables, it's very hard to find any trend either way there. You'll find in the top 10 not only very low spending as a percentage of GDP countries like Japan or Australia, but very high spending countries like Sweden or Norway. And you can't make any sort of simplistic equations between them. But what you do see, I think, particularly with the Scandinavian countries, is I think what I was talking about, which is these are redistributive states. These are states that have a very deep and wide social safety net. They're also free trading countries. They're also countries that have quite low corporate tax rates. They're very conscious of the need to be efficient and to create wealth. And then they set about redistributing it. So they are, I think they can, both sides of that equation are well covered in that, and they are indeed examples to us in many respects.
Munir?
My view is that if you are pursuing economic and social policies which are somewhat close to an ideal state, then indeed there is a trade-off. But if you are, as Andrew said, if you're operating within the production possibility frontier and your policies are in a poor shape, then there is no trade-off. And I'll give you the example of the social assistance program. Just two things. One, if you are on welfare, you have access to 34 specialized benefits, ranging from special diet allowance, which is $500 a month, to extended health benefits, drug, dental, and vision. When you have these kinds of benefits available to people on welfare, but not if you are working, especially low-income jobs, there is no trade-off. You're creating poverty at the same time by not, giving people an incentive to go work when they want to work. You are obviously at the same time creating negative economic outcomes. So there is no trade-off. It's just a lose-lose proposition. So our recommendation in the report is get rid of all of these benefits, raise the basic benefit rate, which would be socially more desirable, and also create incentives for people to work. So you can achieve both the objectives. I'll give you a particularly bad example of how we do policy here in the context of federalism. If you have a disability, you get a disability supplement in one form or another from the government of Ontario, which is close to $5,000 a year. You go to work and you lose that supplement. It's not a small amount of money, $5,000 a year. And the way the disability tax credit works, managed by the federal government, the more you earn, the greater the support that governments would give you. So you have this strange policy where if you are on welfare, you get $5,000. You go to work at a minimum wage job, you get $0. And if you get more and more income, you start getting more and more money from the two levels of government. There's no policy that I am aware of which would suggest, this is a sensible thing to do. So the number one thing in our report is for the two levels of government to actually sort this one thing out, because it's having such a big impact. Have anybody paid any attention to this? Absolutely not. So that's the trade-off issue. What was your second issue?
Second was on federalism.
So I've covered that. So I'm done.
You did. But-
I'm done.
Sure.
Rachel.
I'll take the structure of federalism. I think that the way that our system of political representation has been organized in Canada in our history, we've always had this kind of negotiation between the federal government and the provinces, but the federal government used civil society groups, engaged civil society groups in the dialogue and debate as a way to, of course, bypass provinces. But still, a lot of our dialogue that was happening around what kind of country do we want, what kind of system do we want, was at the federal level, despite the fact that social policy was of provincial jurisdiction. And you've talked about how we used to have collaborative federalism, executive federalism. These civil society groups were engaged in those forums. And to me, one of the big changes is that we no longer have those spaces for dialogue. Social policy decisions are being made unilaterally or transferred unilaterally, and there's no discussion. And the fact that groups are losing their funding, it's surprising to see social inequality in just like a quiet silence in the policy arena. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that civil society groups, these channels for citizen engagement, are weakened, eroding, and very fragile. So that to me is a big issue.
I'll just pick up on the efficiency equity question, Alan. We wax and wane on how we view the relationship between economic policy writ large and social policy, and certainly up until the age of Keynesian economics from the 1940s onwards to the 70s, or however, prior to that, it was seen as very much a zero sum. There was an inherent trade-off between welfare, or the nascent welfare states of the 19th century, early 20th century in economic policy. And Keynes suggested, in the interpretation of Keynes by most liberal democratic governments, was that there was a positive sum relationship between economic and social policy. And then that took a beating, rather a bad beating, through the 1970s, through the 80s, 90s, and neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it. We've had a flash of neo-Keynesianism in the last several years with the economic and fiscal crises of OECD countries. So Keynes is not dead and made a reappearance like a zombie, I guess, in the last several years. But we're seeing other ways of trying to manage, or what Andrew talked about, trying to acknowledge there is a positive sum relationship in a lot of areas, whether we talk about human capital theory, which has come back in terms of calling it social investment, in describing social policies as social investments, social capital, the whole desire of seeing how economic and social policies in a virtuous way enhance cohesion and social networks of trust. The whole debate with the OECD over the last 25 years around active labor market policy activation is really another way of, go from a safety net to a springboard, or these kind of metaphors where we talk about helping people get launched back in, and in the European Union around what they call flex security, which is this idea of trying to marry or twin the flexibility of a labor market with the security of traditional social protection policies in European welfare states. So I think there's an interesting discursive trail there, or language of terms and ideas of trying to find those virtuous connections and interactions. But I think they're happening within a context that Rachel just mentioned of the sense that a lot of democratic spaces have dried up, have withered up. The opportunities for particularly a lot of marginalized groups or social movements representing vulnerable populations, certainly in Canada, feel they have less of an era of governments today than they did 20, 30, 40 years ago. Less of an opportunity to talk about or be engaged or to be treated to. And indeed, their core funding's been slashed, and the capacity of many civil society groups is dangerously at risk. And so, in a sense, that plays into this notion of, is there a distinction or not? Because some voices aren't there that should be. And I think again, just one last comment, I think, on both Munir and Andrew's point. The ability of, and it's not just the social or civil society groups that will be there to lobby for, give us more money, raise the rates, throw more money at the problems. It will be to talk exactly what Andrew was saying and Munir about the intricacies of how actual programs on the ground impact people and have perverse incentives, both perverse social and perverse economic incentives. So there's a lot of space before we hit the trade-offs in a lot of these areas.
I neglected to answer your question about the sort of the changing shape of federalism on this.
You weren't required to.
And yet I want to. Obviously, to some extent, the Constitution is a constraint on anybody's vision, whether you have an expansive vision of the federal role or a more constrained vision. You're working to some extent from the architecture of the Constitution that assigns most responsibility in these areas to the provinces. And yet, there's flexibility within that because of the federal spending power, and we've seen that wax and wane over the years. Part of how you then see the federal role in this is going to be dependent upon how you see the role of government in these areas. And the way I would frame it is this. If you have a very managerial view of the role of the government in some of these social policies, let's take universities, for example. If you think the government should have a very strong role in regulating universities and in assigning responsibilities and regulating the tuition fees, et cetera, then you're going to be more persuaded, perhaps, that you want to have that kind of, if the government's playing a very strong and controlling role, that you want to have that closer, more dispersed to the provincial level, or indeed even beyond the provincial level. And you can think of analogs in social assistance, et cetera. If you have a less managerial role, if you have more of a social market role where the government's role is to transfer cash to individuals to be able to purchase services, then the feds can cut the checks just as easily as the provinces can. And to take a university example, probably should, because the market for universities is at least national, if not international, not provincial. The way we do it now, where we send the money to the provinces and the provinces send the money to the universities, is the funding stops at the border. If the student leaves his or her home province and goes somewhere else, the funding does not follow them. And that's bad for a lot of reasons. So if you, as I say, the more that you tend towards the sort of social market view, the more you might be willing to assign more responsibility to the federal government rather than the provincial governments, again, within the constraints of what we can do within our Constitution. Well, we're actually, I think, seeing a bit of that, surprisingly, from this Harper government that supposedly was not interested in any kind of federal role. And in fact, in some of these areas, they've been more assertive than people might have thought. Some of the stuff, I think, is really dumb. A lot of these boutique tax credits. I mean, people say the Harper government doesn't spend in these things. They do. They spend through the tax system. They have all kinds of spending programs that they deliver through the tax system. And as often as not, they're very poorly designed, and they're just for political reasons rather than for good policy reasons. I'm less harsh than some other perhaps in this room on the Canada Job Grant, for example. I think that's actually more creative and has some possibilities. And that is direct federal transfers to individuals and corporations rather than flowing it through the provinces. And of course, the provinces aren't too keen on that. But I think this is increasingly going to be the trend in the future, probably under either governments of any stripe. I have never had any problem with conditional transfers to the provinces. I know some people view this as being an assault on federalism and an abomination. I never saw it that way. It seems to me perfectly reasonable. If you want the money, you live up to the conditions. If you don't want to live up to the conditions, no one's forcing you to take the money. And in fact, with opting out, we let provinces take the money anyway, even if they weren't living up to the conditions. So I never saw that as being some terrible assault. I do think, though, as we go forward, particularly on this area of health care, where provinces now are spending close to 50% of every dollar just on this one program, this one department, and that's just with the baby boomers beginning to retire. I do think in future there's going to be a shift in emphasis and priorities from what was previously the concern of let's have consistent national standards across the country, and I think that's a very admirable goal. But when we're balancing priorities, I do think we're going to be placing more emphasis in future on allowing provinces to experiment and innovate and trying to figure ways to solve this riddle, this puzzle of how do we make sure that everyone is covered, that we don't sacrifice the extraordinary achievement of universal coverage, and yet be able to deliver it in a way that is both affordable as the aging population goes, and where we're dealing with this very real problem of long waiting lists. So that is just such a huge dilemma for all of the provinces that I think it's going to, as I say, just shift the balance somewhat towards experimentation and allowing different approaches to take hold. Because there's not going to be any big bang approach that's going to solve the healthcare problem. It's going to take a lot of pilot projects and experimentation and trial and error.
Okay, yes, here, go ahead.
Well, there are some big issues where the Constitution is a constraint. But if you start with a proposition that I think most would accept, that there's a link between social and economic policies, and if social is mostly provincial and the federal government is playing a big role on the economic side, it just follows that there needs to be a cooperation and coordination between the two levels of government on this mix of social and economic policies. There's nothing in the Constitution which stops people from the two levels of government to talk to each other and try to figure out a solution. We have nothing like that in this country, and I think there's a need for us to have something in place on the institutional front where the two levels of government work together to make sure their policies are coordinated.
Okay. I want to pick up on something that, maybe switching gears a little bit, but pick up on something that Andrew said in his opening comments. I won't say in passing, but it I think deserves more emphasis. And you made a reference to what we have now in Canada, at least in architecture terms, is most of what we would require for a negative income tax, which isn't, I agree with. As I'm sure many people in this room will know, back in the 1970s, this was the hot topic in social policy, and there was even a big experiment that was being conducted in Manitoba, and it looked like we were really moving in that direction. And then we've heard really nothing about it for 30 or 40 years, and only in the last 5 years, perhaps, do I sense that there's been a resurgence of discussion about negative income tax. And I wanted to put that out on the table and suggest that that might be the model for social policy going forward. But in particular, I would invite Munir to comment on that based on your experience with the Commission on the Social Assistance System in Ontario, and Rachel on your comments, your opening comments about vulnerable populations who have tenuous attachment to both the economy and to society in some ways. This may not be a very effective way to address the concerns and the issues that they face. So let's start perhaps with Munir on this.
I think the first thing one needs to get our views clear on is what objective are we trying to achieve through negative income tax. Obviously, it has something to do with the tax transfer system. So we need to be quite clear as to what are we trying to accomplish, because the negative income tax is simply a delivery mechanism. You can either achieve that objective through direct transfers or make it automatic through refundable tax credits. So the first is first, and the delivery mechanism comes next. And let me just make one other comment here, which may deal with a lot of misunderstanding of an issue, which is consistent with the topic you raised, guaranteed annual income. Some people get really scared of this term guaranteed annual income. The reality is that in Canada we do have guaranteed annual income. It's not just one, it's many guaranteed annual incomes through a variety of programs. So we need to separate the two issues. One, is it sensible to merge a lot of these standalone programs which create their own marginal effective tax rates and their own administration costs into a smaller number of programs with the same amount of money being spent on them, so it's more efficient and creates less trade-off between social and economic, versus should we expand on this stuff? And I think on the first part, where you have fewer guaranteed annual programs, annual income programs, with less administration cost is a desirable thing. So, we need to take another look at, both these aspects of the issue.
Rachel, do you want to?
Well, the one thing that I'd flag is just the general fiscalization of social policy and the fact that a lot of social services are now delivered through the tax system. And that has bypassed or taken away, I think, an important the Department of Finance has very few relationships with the stakeholders. It's easy to manage, it's cost effective, but it takes away a space for stakeholders that used to be able to engage with HRSDC around different programs. And again, there's a good example of how policy making is becoming centralized with very little opportunity for those that are most vulnerable and impacted to provide a voice or engage or share their experience with those that are making the decisions.
Negative income tax, anybody? Yeah.
Well, first of all, just to reiterate what Munir was talking about, and for anybody who's not familiar, is that we have all these different programs that were designed separately and not necessarily in consultation with each other, each of which will have a clawback rate where the benefit is withdrawn as your income rises. Sometimes it's just abruptly, the benefit just disappears, so it's essentially 100%. Oftentimes it's lower than that, but in concert with others, with other programs, you can produce effective tax rates of 100% or more. And again, it's very clear to see how that will hurt people's ability, let alone incentive, to work. People sometimes get worried when you talk about guaranteed annual incomes about, what will be the incentive on work effort. And I always say to them, the real disincentive is not when you give people money when they don't work, it's when you take it away from them when they do. Because you're basically punishing them for taking a job. So it's clearly, bananas that we've allowed this to happen, but it's easier said than done to fix it. But just before I get to that question, there are also arguments made for the guaranteed annual income in terms, so part of it is just to try to reduce that effective tax rate, to withdraw the single benefit, to withdraw it more gradually as income rises, and to reduce that disincentive. So that's a big part of the objective of it. But part of it also is to rationalize and streamline and bring together a lot of different programs into one. And the arguments that are made, and different people will attach different importance to this. But Hugh Siegel, for example, who's done a lot of work on this, places great stress on this, of simplifying the system for people who are in the system makes it easier for them to navigate. They're dealing now with 39 different programs and reams of forms to fill out. And if you're educated and you speak the language and you've got all those advantages, then it's maybe easier. But for somebody who's newer to this, it sometimes can be just absolutely bewildering. So that's got to be a concern. And what he would also say, and again, people may disagree with this, is that he's come to the conclusion that it would be better for a lot of these people just to give them the money and let them make their own choices rather than delivering them services that they only get if they conform and if they obey and if they do what the social worker wants them to do. Now that's, you can argue that one both ways. Some people will say that's too simple. People have special needs, they have different needs, and just giving them money isn't going to fit for everybody, and that's a good argument to have, but that's certainly part of the argument. The reason why though I'm sympathetic to it in principle, I'm skeptical that we're going to see it anytime soon, is just partly it's just arithmetic. If you're going to have a very gradual rate of withdrawal, that means you're continuing to pay benefit to people higher and higher up the income scale. And you can see the math pretty quickly. The more gradually you withdraw the benefit, the lower the initial benefit has to be to keep the cost within whatever your initial estimate was. And you can very quickly, you can see how the cost can escalate beyond the areas that the governments really can deliver on. So that's one dilemma. Secondly, part of the way to make the numbers work is to rationalize some of these existing programs within the one thing. So you're spending more on the new program, but you're spending less on the old programs. But then you run into objections from the provinces who run those programs for good reasons or bad, depending on how you view these things, that they're unwilling to give those up. So that makes it very difficult politically to work. So I am of the view that I think it's something we want to work towards, that we're going to do it gradually, that we're going to build on these building blocks that I mentioned of these relatively well-designed programs, but they can be improved and certainly rationalized together. But programs that do deliver a cash benefit that is then gradually withdrawn. And what I would certainly support is devoting the marginal dollar, devoting the increased resources we have to building and improving and expanding and rationalizing those programs so that we approach closer and closer to that ideal of a negative income tax or a guaranteed annual income. They're two names for the same thing. And I think that's a goal to work towards rather than saying we're going to do it in one big reform.
Just a quick word, Alan.
Yeah, just a second, Mike,
Yep.
just before. In a minute or two, I'm going to open the floor for questions and comments. So if you would like to pose something to the panel, I would invite you now to start moving towards one of these two microphones on the aisle. Okay, Michael.
Hugh Segal was mentioned, just a report that he co-chaired with Art Eggleton from about 5 or 6 years ago. There's a Senate standing report on called In From the Margins, I believe, and there's a nice discussion in there around the whole guaranteed income question. To me, it's a pipe dream, and it's also a political distraction. It'll never happen. And even if it did, 10 years later, we'd have the 37 categories that Munir talked about. Why would we? Well, we'd say, okay, get everyone the same money. Then you'd say, oh, but you have a severe disability. Oh, well, then that needs some additional, and you're a veteran. Well, veterans, we support the troops, so God bless you for defending the country. You get a little extra because you're a veteran. And then there's this, then there's that. And life is too complicated for writing. It's a lovely dream that some on the left, but mainly those on the right, talk about cash it out. It's like dealing with Indigenous people. Sign a treaty, cash a check, goodbye. And let's just clear the tables and the books on these issues. And the service trade-off is a good one to talk about, but services will always be needed as well. I think we need to focus more on getting civil society groups mobilized again around their issues rather than talking about these very abstract utopian ideas. There's an opinion.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. All right, we've got some people lined up, so let's start. We'll alternate. Nick, do you want to start us off? And please start by identifying yourself.
Nick Falvo, PhD candidate in this program. 4 excellent presentations. Thanks so much. I want to ask a question about poverty measurement. Andrew Coyne mentioned that fewer and fewer Canadians are falling below the LICO, but I note that the LICO has not been rebased since 1992. So I want to stir the pot a bit and ask our former chief statistician whether he thinks it's appropriate for us to be looking at the LICO in that way. In other words, given that it hasn't been rebased in more than 2 decades, should we be looking at the percentage of Canadian households falling below it over time? Or would it be more appropriate to look at other measures such as the low-income measure?
Well, there are 3 measures out there. LICO is one, there's LIM, and of course the market-based measure, which more correctly, I think, reflects the cost of living. So let me make 2 points in this context. One, when I became the chief statistician at that time, it was a major topic for debate in StatCan, working with HRSTC as to, what is the poverty measure. And I mean, this thing has been going on for a while. And my view was, you tell us what poverty is, we measure it. But don't expect StatCan to define what poverty is. Nobody in the country wants to take that challenge on. So as soon as people said, we can't define poverty, I said, let's stop the whole stuff. We are not going to spend our time working on an issue which is not StatCan issue. Mm-hmm. So I am still where I was. Tell us what poverty is, we'll measure it. The second comment I want to make is, I think this is really an academic exercise as to where do you draw the line under which you have poor people and above which you don't. I think it's a continuum. The lower your income level, the bigger the risk that you are actually not able to afford certain reasonable things in life that you should. And as you go up the income scale, your situation is somewhat better. So I personally don't worry that much about a poverty line.
Could I just offer a few thoughts on that? It's true that the StatsCan made a decision to stick with the 1992 base, and I've got a sheaf of papers where they were arguing back and forth within StatCan, and Munir would be familiar with those debates. The part of the reason I cited that is we've got data for the LICO going back to 1976, which we don't have with the market basket measure, for example. My view has always been in these debates about relative versus absolute things, we should measure both, because they each tell us something. And it's absolutely worthwhile to know how many people are falling below 1/2 the median. And in fact, it's a very valid measure because I wish we were paying more attention to the divide between the poor and the rest of us, rather than the rest of us and the 1%, which I find much less interesting or compelling as a focus of social policy. We should be much more concerned about the distance. People talk about the gap between the rich and the poor. What matters to a single mother in welfare is not that she can't afford a yacht. It's that she can't afford to send her kid on a school trip or these kinds of basic things that the average person has. So that, say, 1/2 median tells us that. But it's also useful to know, are we making progress on sort of providing people with the basic necessities? I think I agree with Munir that over time the market basket measure is going to be the better measure for that, and maybe LICO over time will be phased out. The problem with LICO in the past was, when it was constantly being rebased, was it wasn't clear what it was. It wasn't clear to what extent it was relativistic, to what extent it was absolute. It was trying to do a bit of both, and I think was harmed in its usefulness as a result of that. So I would rather than making one measure try to do both, I think it's a better idea that we'll now have a market basket measure that is sort of relatively absolute, and a 1/2 the median measure, which is more relativistic, and those both provide us with useful information.
Okay, let's over here, please.
Oh, yes. My name is Barbara Kay. I graduated from the MPA program 20 years ago. And I think most of us in this room would agree that the lexicon of public policy and the framework of public policy is always evolving. That's why we're still here 60 years later. I find that a lot of the basic concepts that are being taught, or were being taught anyway, in Economics 101, Political Science 101, are being really stood on their head. So I have a couple of comments here. One is to do with the notion that governments put forward that, well, once we've balanced our budget, we can afford to boost our social programs and that, whereas the economic, I guess, Keynesianism or whatever would have said that, well, when times are bad, that's when the government gives you the counter-cyclical measures, the social programs, and when times are good, that's when they kind of pull back. So that's one point. And the other...
I'm going to hold you to 1 point for now because
Oh, all
you've got
right,
other
fair
people
enough.
in line. Thank
Sure.
you. Anyone want to comment on?
It's such a large debate.
Yeah.
Maybe we could hear some more questions. And then
Okay.
wrap
Well,
them
let's
up
put
in our comments.
Jordan Charbonneau. I work for the Government of Canada and Treasury Board Secretariat and a current student in the MPA. I found the comments very helpful in helping me think through these issues myself, but I'm surprised that no one questioned the premise, because we talked about the vanishing distinction between economic and social policy, but was it an artificial distinction to begin with? Like, should we be thinking of these things together, regardless of whether a policy affects how people spend money or how they literally socialize in a society? Shouldn't we be thinking of both? And there were comments to that effect, but were they ever really distinct? And was it ever useful to think of them as distinct? Should we be considering them holistically?
Okay, let's get one more on the floor, and then then I'll come back to the panel.
Okay, Annie McEwen, PhD candidate in the program here.
A little closer to the mic, please.
Oh, closer. My question, I just wanted to push the panel a bit. You did a lot of problem definition about what's going on, the context, which is important and good. And then we talked about one potential path forward, the minimum or guaranteed basic income, whatever you want to call it. And we see a surplus potentially coming. And we see this increasing sort of diversification across the provinces in social policy. So what are the next big social policies? We haven't really had a big announcement, I would say, since about 2000, maybe in 2006, in the debate about childcare, and we ended up with the UCCB, but we don't have a lot of big announcements, big changes happening. So what's the next big thing that's coming down the pipeline?
Okay. Anyone like to respond on that?
Sure. Just first of all, on the point about the social and the economic, as I say, we were most of us saying that you do want to see them integrated. I think the concern that was implicit in the question was that economic policy was starting to subsume social policy, and that we were forgetting social policy concerns in the pursuit of just raw efficiency. I'm not as persuaded that that's what's happening, but that's certainly something you want to be you would not want to see. You would not want to see people ignoring the purpose of these programs, and sometimes with some of the rhetoric, at least of the federal government, it sounds like they think that way. But I don't think you've seen that quite as starkly in policy as perhaps maybe some other people in the room might say. Just on the what do we do with the approaching surplus? Let's not be too hasty in thinking that those surpluses are going to last. And point one. Point two, whatever's happening at the federal level, what matters ultimately is the fiscal balance for the country as a whole. And the provinces are going to be facing real challenges in the years and decades to come. So whatever that federal surplus is going to be swamped by, I think, potentially deficits on the provincial level. Again, because of this demographic challenge that they're facing. And the feds have kind of insulated themselves from a lot of over the last 20 years, from a lot of the fiscal consequences of that. Now, in a way, that puts the feds in a powerful position because the provinces are going to be the demandeurs. They're going to need the money, and the feds are going to have it. And if this doesn't sound too hard-hearted, I hope the feds use that leverage to their advantage. I hope they, for example, get serious about the economic union and breaking down interprovincial trade barriers. And I would say, let's come to an understanding here that we're not just going to give you this money for free, but there's going to be a new type of conditionality. And the conditionality is going to be you stop blocking people from coming to work in your province, et cetera, and we act like a proper country. Anyway, I hope the feds will do that. I think for those who are looking to expand into new areas and new types of social programs, there is potentially room even for a flinty-eyed fiscal conservative, which is to say there are areas in which we can potentially make both efficiency and equity gains within the healthcare field, in home care and in pharmacare, where if you can encourage people, for example, to make use of drugs that they might not otherwise be able to afford, you might save in terms of your costs in the operating room. And so there's potentially room there. The fiscal conservative side of me says, boy, yeah, but we could really blow the design of this. And we wind up with something that costs 20 times more than we thought it was going to cost. And so I approach it with some hesitation, but there is, at least in principle, the opportunity there to achieve both an equity gain and an efficiency gain.
I think the next big idea, I'll just throw one out, is tax reform, capital T, capital R. I mean, sometime in the next one or two prime ministers will have to clean up all this tax code complexity and messes of the proliferation of tax credits we've seen. Secondly, the sales tax. I take the point about European countries. Again, life after 5% GST, we have to look at how to use consumption tax or resale tax in a much more robust way. Carbon tax, on environmental issues, and on the healthcare, I think there's possibilities of using tax instruments for health promotion and public health. So I'd bundle that up and say, I know you've written on this, Alan. Once a generation or two we take on tax reform, that would be one of mine on my short list.
Please.
I'm Javi Eckenberg. I'm a doctoral student who withdrew from the program in this university, and I work at the Library of Parliament as a policy analyst. I think I just want to turn back to the panel, this question. I think Munir is right. I think it's very difficult at the federal level to have a conversation about social and economic and fiscal policy and how they interrelate. And I think Rachel is right that civil society's been hollowed out for lots of reasons. So my question is to you, what is the role of academia and the media in making sure that that conversation about the interrelationship works beyond this session in this room?
Okay, Chris, we'll get yours on as well.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Chris Stoney, within the School of Public Policy and Administration. I just wondered, you talked about stimulus policy, and obviously Chrysler currently are also got their hands out for public money. I wondered whether we should see so-called corporate welfare as effective economic policy, effective social policy, or perhaps effective political policy. Thank you.
Well, two rather different themes. Anybody want to?
Sure, I'll take Javi's question.
Okay.
one of the things that I have found surprising in the past year and a half, is all of these new movements like Occupy movement, like Idle No More, like the student movement in Quebec, which I find are really interesting because they're a different way of engaging in the public sphere. They're not targeted to the state. They themselves don't recognize the traditional actors, which are civil society stakeholders and media. They tend to have their own countercultural source of information in order to engage directly with the citizen. So I wonder about your question, whether we're past that point in terms of engaging academia and media. And my feeling is that the level of disengagement and disenfranchisement is beyond that, and that we'll see more of these types of movements because our representational system hasn't been able to incorporate a voice for these marginalized groups.
Here.
Several years ago, 7-8 years ago, I happened to be part of a deputy minister's group that went to Australia to meet our counterparts. We were there for 10 days, and my experience reading the Australian media during that 10 days was that in those 10 days, they dealt with public policy issues, academics included, more than I've seen those issues discussed in the Canadian media over more than a year. For some reason that I don't understand, the Canadian media doesn't take these public policy issues as seriously, and again, for some reason I don't understand, the academics are not engaged in that conversation to the extent other countries. I mean, the US is a great example where academics play a much bigger role on the public policy front in public than we do in Canada.
Andrew?
Just on the corporate welfare question, it's like throwing red meat in front of me. It's bad economic policy. It's bad social policy. It's appalling. You know, it's not just people forget that there's a cost to these things. The industry, any industry that's recipient of any of this money, always points to all the jobs and people they employ and the wonderful things they do. They never point to the jobs that are destroyed to divert resources into that industry versus all the others. And it's inevitable. It's not. This isn't theory. It's the reality. Is nothing comes free. So it's not just the tax cost. It's the diversion of capital and labor into that industry that might have been more usefully employed elsewhere. People will then say, oh yes, but we can't be the Boy Scouts in the world, you know, the other countries subsidize their industries. That works in your blackboard theory world, but not in the real world of pragmatism. And these pragmatists don't understand is that what is essentially animating that idea is God has decreed that we must make cars in Ontario. They've taken that as a self-evident truth, and then everything else has to revolve around that. And I don't accept that as being a self-evident truth. I think we should make things that actually make sense to make economically in our province, and we should have investment there because it wants to be there, because it makes sense to be there, not because we're either bribing or coercing them to be there. So it's bad policy on any number of fronts. Where I get a bit angry about this, and I'll tell you a little story, I'll keep it short, but I went to a lunch one time, and I have to preface this being sponsored by the Fraser Institute, but bear with me. It was an award they give every year for efficiency in social activist groups, in people who are delivering frontline services. So groups that run group shelters and group homes and these things. And these people were as proud as punch to receive this award, because they were quoting Peter Drucker and showing how they'd applied it. So, because what these people who are working on tiny, tiny budgets and saving people's lives, what they understood better than anybody here was inefficiency is theft. Inefficiency kills. If you're wasting money, that's $1 you couldn't have done to help that person. So this mattered to them in a big way. And I'm sitting there watching these people talking about how they'd wrung out every possible gain from the meager resources they're doing to save troubled youth, etc. And then I'm thinking about, Bombardier vice presidents at their ski chalets on my dime. These hundreds of millions that we're throwing at these corporations that could have been used in 1,000 different ways, one of which would have been helping these people save lives. So yeah, don't get me started.
All right, we're almost out of time, so I'll ask for very quick interventions from the remaining people.
Sure. Mitch Cooney, I'm a graduate of the MAPA program. I wanted to hone in on one particular issue because it's kind of glaring right behind you, philanthropy and nonprofit leadership, one of the favorite vehicles for governments to deliver policy, as you alluded to, Rachel. And so, there's been this rise of, you can't really deny in this sector that there has been at least a bridging of social and economic policy. I don't think that many people will deny that the nonprofit sector is facing that with a rising of bridge terms like venture philanthropy, social enterprise, impact investing. Andrew, I think you even use the term social markets. So I want to get your opinion on how do you think that this is going to affect specifically the nonprofit sector in Canada, and what are some of the real consequences of the fact that we have basically asked nonprofits to be businesses now?
Okay, and we'll get the last question, Jennifer, your question on the floor as well.
Jennifer Robson, I'm an assistant professor here at Carleton and a recent SPPA grad as well. Question about institutional capacity. Many of the panelists talked about difficulties in having conversations, doing analysis, breaking down policy silos, having conversations across sectors, across jurisdictions. What's the response in terms of institutional capacity? Do we miss the old national councils like the Economic Council, the National Council on Welfare? Was that the answer?
I have to take
Rachel,
that question. I think the change has already happened. What you're referring to, this move towards social enterprise, social investment, social innovation, which is really big around the world in many countries as like the solution to a lot of these social policy problems. They, to me, reflect such a narrow definition of what civil society is that we're already just talking about service delivery. We're talking about different mechanisms to generate funds to make sure that service delivery happens, but there's absolutely no space in that kind of debate on advocacy, voice, on empowering and making sure that the people that are targeted by those programs also have the opportunity to participate in the policy process. Now, I think that it is possible under that kind of framework, because in Quebec we have social economy organizations. They are actually very advocacy oriented, but their number one defining characteristics is their democratic model and that they are there to serve the community. Whereas outside of Quebec, every time I hear social enterprise and social innovation, it's about this business model. It's about how can we generate funds, and the whole question of democratic governance and roots in the community is absent. And so I find that discourse very problematic, because we're already way past the point where we've forgotten about advocacy.
Just want to make an observation on institutional capacity. It's particularly weak in provinces, especially Ontario. And my experience at the federal level is it has diminished over time, even at the federal level.
Last opportunity, 30 seconds.
I would reinstate the court challenges program. I would change charity tax laws in this country so that there'd be more space for genuine democratic engagement. I mean, the games nonprofits have to play to describe what they do so that they'll get funding is ridiculous. And I mean, there's so many anti-democratic effects of so many of our public policies now in this country. There's a lifetime of work there for a School of Public Policy and Administration.
Very quickly on the social enterprise, we don't have all the answers. We need innovation. We need trial and error. We need people trying new things. We need people searching out new ways of doing things. I can't help myself. I come from an economics background. Incentives matter. You wish it were otherwise. You wish people just did things because it was the right thing to do. But there's just such a world of research that shows that people respond to incentives, and if we can create incentives for people to seek out new ways within the social sector, we get the incentives right, and that's always a key question, is you don't want perverse incentives where they lead them down the wrong trail, but if you get the incentives right, I think it holds out opportunity for new and innovative approaches to questions that have bedeviled us under the old ways of doing things for centuries.
All right, we're right on time. I'd like you to join me in thanking what I think was a great panel to start off with.
I can't resist making the comment that employment in the nonprofit and voluntary sector is 11 times greater than the auto industry. What kind of achievement was this? Almost an hour with academics and experts and no PowerPoint. I think that is a first, that in itself, let alone the substance, of the conversation has to be commended. This event is, of course, part of the celebration of the school's at least 60th anniversary. The study of public administration was part of the founding of Carleton. We created an professional institute of public administration in 1943. We became a graduate school in 1953-54. And we've been engaging in this kind of dialogue with the public and practitioners ever since. In 1981, we started How Ottawa Spends, the annual review of federal policy and spending. And you'll see the posters. We put all the covers out as posters. But if you want a good history, if you want to look at how some of these topics have been debated over 30 plus years, How Ottawa Spends is a wonderful repository. And I think there has been, well, I'm quite confident, there has been no author who has appeared more times in How Ottawa Spends than Mike Prince. And he takes the consistency level. We also did a little poll last night because I mentioned that part of what the editors of How Ottawa Spends have always done is to have a great challenge among themselves over the years as to who could get the best title. Of course, the authors do it for individual chapters, but the overall book has had a competition. And we did a little instant poll, and we asked last night at the reception, which of the titles over the years best captures the economic and political situation in Canada for the next few years? So which of the titles over the past 30 years is most suitable going forward? And let me give you the top 5. In 5th spot, Life Under the Knife. That was 1996-97. Past Imperfect, Future Tense. That was How Ottawa Spends, 2000-2001. Trimming Fat or Slicing Pork. That was 2011-12. In number 2 spot, The Harper Conservatives, Climate of Change. It was 2007-8. And in top spot, The Harper Government, Good to Go. That's the current issue, and is also for sale outside. Usually we ask you at these events to put away your phone. Don't. You could turn it off, but don't put it away. We encourage you to use Twitter and at Carleton SPPA and at hashtag SPPA60. And for the next session, right after the break, we're going to do another instant poll where you can text in your responses to it, and we will have another immediate response to your assessment of where we are. So please enjoy the break, and again, thanks to a great panel.